Thank you very much, Chinwe, and thank you all for having me here. The title of my presentation, and let me know if you can't hear me well, is "The Gift is the Curse." It stems from a hip hop album by Jay-Z back when there were CDs. There was one side of it was The Gift, which talked about all the benefits of fame and fortune and all those things, and the other side was darker and talked about all the challenges. I've come to believe that there often aren't two sides to the same issue, that oftentimes the very thing that is the gift that gives you the ability to prosper oftentimes is the exact same thing that may lead to your demise. In the case of Africa, I think about it in an inverse, and I'll talk a bit more about that. It's not that popular to say these days, but objectively speaking, the continent is not doing that well. Here I chose a very simple measure, which is GDP per capita on a purchasing power parity basis. And if you look at, obviously, some of the developed regions, it's not even close. But even Latin America, emerging Asia, you're still looking at 20 to 25% of their GDP per capita, which is a very common measure of just like personal, the sort of economic resources available to an individual. If this were infant mortality, if this were disposable income, it would look roughly the same, right? But things are getting better, kind of, right? If you project forward from 2017 to 2024, things aren't actually projected to get better in any sort of dramatic or material fashion whereby you would say that the continent is moving into sort of middle income status. So, what do we do about that? So fundamentally, my belief, I think it's reasonably well grounded, is that the plight of Africa is one of poor governance and poor leadership, and that the fundamental infrastructure across financial, supply chain, infrastructural, and human capital hasn't been put in place due to poor leadership and a lack of long-term execution. I don't say long-term planning because if you've ever been to an IFC or any kind of African government conference, there are lots of plans, right? There are the 2020 plan, the 2030, the 2050, and all these things that are going to happen, but fundamentally it comes down to execution, and that has been lacking significantly. So that is the curse. In this case, I believe that the curse is also the gift, which is that this lack of centralized infrastructure positions the continent to be more readily able to adopt decentralized and digitally led solutions for everyday problems. Mark Andreessen, the famous venture capitalist, says software is eating the world, and I believe that firmly. In an ecosystem where you don't have legacy systems, you don't have legacy thinking, and you don't have entrenched interests in old world technologies, it's easier to adopt software-led technologies that allow you to leapfrog certain development stages. So what are the components of this? The first, for me, I believe, is the availability of connected devices, whether that be sensors, if you're looking at IoT, mobile phones, computers, and on the continent, by far the most powerful device that exists is the smartphone. Over 95, if you look at some of your larger Anglophone-speaking countries, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, over 90% of all internet access is done through the phone. And therefore, it is the primary mechanism by which people connect to the internet and are able to access all of the benefits, goods, and services that are available on the internet. So simply put, more smartphones in people's hands equals a good thing. And if you look here, it will demonstrate that that is not only growing quickly, but is projected to grow, I would say, somewhat astronomically. Projecting out to 2024, the sub-Saharan Africa is projected to have more than double, or roughly double, the number of smartphones as exists in North America today. So this is a very large aggregate market, and they're going to add more than 400 million smartphones in that period. The driver of this, which I think is very important, particularly for either an American or sort of American socialized audience, is lower cost smartphones, which are primarily produced and distributed from China in particular. So, companies like Apple, some of your higher end Asian companies like Samsung had the head start by a mile. And there are a couple companies, two of these brands are from one company called Transsion. Based in Shenzhen, started probably about 5 years ago. They make smartphones that are basically 80% of the specs of a high-end Samsung, but cost probably 20%, right? And they focus on distribution. There aren't any shiny billboards. And fundamentally, they have, in just a very short period of time, fundamentally changed the landscape of the smartphone market. And they just IPO'd a few weeks ago for $4 billion. Just low-cost smartphones in Africa. The second component is connectivity. If you have a smartphone, but you're not able to connect to broadband or Wi-Fi, then it's more or less worthless. And if you look here, the continent, so this is annual consumption of data in something called exabytes, which I think is a very large denomination. And look, this is projected to grow by over 10x. This is 12x from 2017 to 24. So that indicates that we think something is likely to go right in that space as well. And the final piece is you need actual use cases and applications that are well suited to your abilities, that are well suited to your environment and your needs. And here I draw a dichotomy that I call sort of mobile content 1.0 versus 2.0. Mobile content 1.0 was in the feature phone era, and it was basically dominated by large telco monopolies. If you want to access someone who has a feature phone, the only way to do it is through a partnership with a telco. If you want to give them the ability to pay for things, the only way to do it is through a partnership with a telco. And what the telcos did, which I believe is very short-sighted, is they leveraged that monopoly power to basically cut very, very aggressive and unsustainable deals with content producers. So the value-added service guys were cutting deals where they were getting 15 to 30% of the revenues. Telcos were getting the rest. And so basically they never got off the ground. They're all more or less dead. In mobile content 2.0, it's very excited. The internet is open. As long as someone has connectivity, you can reach them. They can download an application. They can go to your website. You can push messaging to them. So access has been sort of decentralized or democratized. Monetization as well, the same way. There have been a rise of local payment gateways, which allow people to use different local means in order to pay for things, whether it's mobile money, local bank transfer, or cards that you probably have never heard of that are indigenous to particular countries. So this is very exciting, and this provides the ecosystem for content producers to produce applications or interfaces that actually allow you to produce usable things for people on top of the first two components. So what has been the result of this? It's actually been a very, very exciting time over the last 5 years. And what we've seen is that startups have sort of taken the mantle and stepped in and filled a number of deficiencies that fundamentally, traditionally would fall in the hands or within the remit of government. So I'll just take a few examples. So Chinwe mentioned I'm an active angel investor. Now I'm probably at like somewhere like 20 investments. So I'm also plugging a few of my companies here, which I always like to do. So we'll take one example, which is probably the most famous, which is M-Pesa. M-Pesa is a mobile money player in East Africa, predominantly Kenya. And basically, the country lacks basic financial infrastructure. Switching, which allows you to sort of transfer between banks, credit cards, ATMs, basic things that facilitate traditional sort of financial transactions. M-Pesa is a program that you can use on USSD. It allows you to remit money via your mobile phone. So if you have and it doesn't actually require a smartphone. So old school USSD phone, I can send money to anyone within the country that has it. I can go to an agent and withdraw cash or put cash into the ecosystem. If I walk up to a store or stall, they have their little M-Pesa kiosk. You type in the number, transaction's done, you walk away. This is a very, very powerful example. I was just looking at the stats. So it's estimated that about 43% of the GDP of Kenya flows through M-Pesa every year. And if you look globally at mobile money customers, about 45% of them globally reside on the African continent. So this is something where Africa has leapfrogged the world and created an ecosystem that is unrivaled anywhere, even in Southeast Asia. It's about 30% there. So that's pretty spectacular. If you look at some more recent companies, I'll take an example in the transportation and logistics. Max.ng in Nigeria, transportation infrastructure is pretty terrible. You don't have trains, you don't have well-organized buses, and you definitely don't have like good highways whereby you could facilitate road travel. So Max is a company that leverages is like Uber for motorbikes. And so, in a world where you have terrible roads, in a world where it's very difficult to get from one place to the other, having a smartphone, being able to hail a motorbike, you can weave in between traffic. If you need to go off-road, you can go off-road. If you need to go to a place that is very difficult to access, you can do it. So that's a very interesting example. On the identity and credit side, there's a company called Smile Identity. Fundamentally, credit, which is in many ways the lifeblood of expanding economies, is predicated on identity. You need to know who a person is, who a business is, have a record of their history in order to be able to have the trust to underwrite credit to them and therefore give them the ability to run their business or expand. And unfortunately, these types of identity systems, whether it be credit scoring, whether it be very simple ID cards, social security numbers, oftentimes don't exist because the execution on the government side to get them to be ubiquitous has been poor. Smile Identity is a company that uses facial recognition technology in order to authenticate users. And so you don't need to have collected a fingerprint, you don't need a birth certificate, as long as the face that is looking at the phone at that time is the same face as the person who registered originally. That can be authenticated, that people can get loans, people can get access to secure accounts, and it's a very interesting application of something that in the West we kind of use like to maybe unlock your phone. It's like a little cooler than a fingerprint. And there are countless, I've only put 3 here, companies in the energy space that are completely bypassing centralized generation and distribution and leveraging distributed, whether it be solar or other technologies, creating microgrids, and this is very powerful. So this is really great fundamentally, but unfortunately it's not that easy. There still remain significant challenges to what I call digital inclusion, which is people having the skills, the access, and the knowledge to be able to leverage all of the benefits that the connected world, the internet, has to offer. The first of those remaining challenges is that even though connectivity is available, data is very, very expensive for your average person on the continent. Simple benchmarking in, again, Nigeria, Kenya, and SA shows that for a gigabyte of prepaid data, it costs roughly 6 to 7 times what it would cost someone in the US on a PPP basis. So that's something that is ubiquitous in the US. It's like turning on the tap, is a very, very conscious and meaningful purchase for someone who's on the continent. So that's problematic. The second is that digital payments outside of Kenya and M-Pesa still remain very, very challenging. For the most part, if you look at global applications, the way that you're able to buy or engage with it is through some kind of interface, Google Play Billing, Apple Billing, PayPal, and those reside fundamentally on an internationally compatible credit card. Not a lot of people have those. And so a whole host of goods services are not accessible for people because it's still really hard to pay. And then the final thing is that because this ecosystem is so new, there are very few content producers, and you don't have a mature ecosystem whereby people have culturally relevant content and culturally relevant distribution. If you can't get it to people in a way that they are used to or that is accessible for them, it may as well not exist. So what is the obligation that we have as people who would like to not only see the continent flourish, but also participate and help catalyze that? My view is the obligation is for us to look to fulfill the promise by creating customized solutions for what are, in this day and age, fundamentally custom problems. They don't exist across the globe. And so to that end, we're going to talk a bit about what I do and how I try and do that with my company, which I started about 1.5 years ago. So the company's called Kerry First. We are an interactive entertainment company focused on Africa. The short form of that is we make games, social platforms, and digital commerce applications to engage people. When we talk about those 3 issues that I laid out, data being expensive, distribution and content not being well catered to the environment, and payments, we look to tackle those in a systematic manner to provide access to people. So we build applications that are very, very compact. If you think about data for an application, most of it is consumed upon download and upon update. We don't really think about it, but the average person in Nigeria will check the size of an application before they download it. And if it's too big, that fundamentally means it's too expensive. And so one of our games is called Kerry First Trivia. It's about 7.5 megabytes to download. Its largest competitor in Nigeria is Candy Crush Saga, which I'm sure some of you have played on your commutes, is about 85 megabytes to download. And that's not even a hardcore game. Fortnite Android game is 2 gigs, right? So somewhere between 5%, 0.5% and 10% the size of an internationally available competitor. The second is we leverage local networks both to market and distribute, but also to sort of create evergreen content within our applications. And the final piece is we go around and we integrate with local gateways, a bunch of those names that you saw on the prior slide, in order to create a pool of payment options that are accessible locally. We believe that Africa is roughly, in some ways, where China was 20 years ago. And if you look at sort of our I would say our role model globally, it's Tencent. Tencent is probably worth $100 billion today. and they do essentially the same thing. But they were launched 20 years ago. They started with a single localized application, in their case Messenger, grew very quickly, were able to cross-sell different goods and services to this consumer base that they now knew very well. And then eventually they became a publisher, whereby they were able to become the gateway for interesting content globally that needed or wanted to access the Chinese customer. So you go from, being a localizer to being much more of a platform and fundamentally expanding the range of digital goods and services that are available to your consumer base. We have a couple games out. One is a knowledge-based trivia game where people log on at the same time, they play against each other, and whoever gets the most questions right has a chance to win a bit of money. So it's like a gamification of education, it's social, it's fun, and it has a very natural and intuitive incentive structure. The second is in beta form, which we're launching now. That name could change, so don't quote me on it. But it's a single application where we rotate multiple very simple old school arcade style games. If you ever played Pong or Flappy Bird or even like Tetris, these are very interesting concepts that we've moved past in many ways in the West, but that work really well. They're data light. And having one application where you can play multiple games means you don't have to download multiple applications. You save data. Fundamentally, we believe that games are an interesting entree into digital commerce. If you think about a free-to-play game, it's just a digital economy. You get in there, you mess around a little bit, you can buy some things, whether they improve your chances of winning, they make your experience better, or even if they're a cloak or a special sword that makes you feel good and look cool to your friends. But fundamentally, all of the infrastructure that's required to do that for a game can be extended to what is traditionally considered more useful goods and services. So you can purchase airtime and data, you can transfer value to your friends, family, enemies. You can buy content in the traditional sense, like you think about like a Udemy that has educational or informal style content. Anything that can be both distributed and consumed on your phone, which as time goes will be an increasing pool of goods and services, can be an extension from the same infrastructure that you use to create a free-to-play game. We localize distribution. So the first is creating gamified ways for people to share the application with their friends. The second, and if you want, I can show you a link. We have a YouTube channel. Is we leverage local influencers, so mainly comedians, to make short-form videos and use those to advertise our application. So they're funny, they're engaging, they're usually in local sort of slang, and so they're relatable to people. And then the final piece, which I think is really important, and I'd like to touch on, is we're developing what we call an ambassador network. Ambassador network is individual agents and retail partners that have the ability to distribute our digital currency and our applications and make money as a result of that. So simple example in Kerry First Trivia, we have something called a credit. It allows you to play premium games, you can buy extra lives. It's quite useful, you can send it to your friends. If someone applies to become an ambassador and we accept them, they get an embedded discount on credits. So they buy credits at 80 cents on the dollar. If they buy them in volume, there are volume discounts. And then when they transfer them or sell them to friends, family, customers, they make an embedded margin. I think in the world of digital, right, on the continent in particular, we can't forget about traditional, culturally relevant distribution means. If people are still much more comfortable looking someone in the eye whether they're handing them cash, whether they're porting over mobile money, there's still requires this sort of cultural and familial trust in order to get people to adopt new things. And I think a lot of people who try and port over models on the continent lose sight of some of the core tenets. And so if you look at the biggest consumer companies on the continent, they're the telcos, which I read are sort of collectively do, I think, $80 billion a year. They, even though airtime and credit can be ported from anywhere in the world to anywhere else, I would say roughly 90% of their sales are through physical agents. If you look at FMCG companies, Unilever, Coca-Cola, they build things in big, shiny, centralized factories, but fundamentally, in Nigeria, for example, 90% of retail is in informal markets. Big, seemingly chaotic places where things are sold effectively peer-to-peer. So it's really important as we think about fashioning solutions for the continent that are decentralized, that do leverage technology, to not forget about some of the core tenets that really make them scalable and adaptable for the particular geographies. And then the final piece is payments. As I mentioned, it's a big issue. And so what we do is, it's actually very difficult. We go around and we integrate with basically any gateway in any major country that we're targeting. It takes engineering capacity, it takes business development capacity, there's a lot of testing, but fundamentally what it does is it gives a consumer who previously would only be able to use Google Play billing, about 15% of them, depending on the country, would be able to access it, and it opens up a range of options. So you can use a local card, you can do bank transfer in places like Nigeria, very popular, they have very good switching, or you could use mobile money. Now you've basically opened up this ecosystem for anyone to be able to access and consume your goods. So the results have been good. We launched our first game in March. By mid-April, we were the #1 game in Nigeria. Most days since then, we've been ranked #1 in downloads. We've hit critical scale, and importantly, people really appreciate it. That 4.7 out of 5 rating, if you ever look in app stores, particularly on Android, is unusually high. And it indicates to us that hopefully we're doing something well. The doing well sort of economically and in scale and customers is one thing, but fundamentally we believe that we're here to try and make the continent a better place. And there's a whole rise of style of investors, which are impact investors. And if anyone here considers themselves an impact investor, please don't be offended by the soapbox I'm about to go on. A lot of the thesis for impact investing started from bilateral aid. Bilateral aid was big, development finance institutions took a bunch of cash, they handed them to presidents, and they said, do stuff. And over a 20 to 30 year period, people realized that that's not actually a good way to improve outcomes in low-income countries. Why? You give someone a pile of cash that already has poor governance practices, that is self-interested as opposed to collectively, that cash gets squandered. If you hand cash or goods directly to people, there's the bed nets example, you destroy local economies, right? If I get a free bed net, I'm not gonna buy the one from the lady down the street who's weaving them by hand. And fundamentally, you breed dependence, right? So that was phase one. People were like, not good. Okay, we've learned. Now there's a wave of impact investing, which is all right, we will invest in companies, but they have to have a very demonstrative and obvious impact. So we have this double bottom line. The challenge with that is that in order to demonstrate your impact, people tend to use very, very blunt mechanisms to do so. So people opt for things that feel good or that look good in a picture on the front of a website, take, you know, the farmer lady with her USSD phone, getting agronomic data from, you know, from your company, or, yeah, you probably have seen all those pictures, as opposed to taking a view, which I believe is that jobs are impact, right? If you build big, sustainable companies that serve needs, hire people, and ideally pay their taxes, that is the most powerful impact that you can have on a region and on a geography, period, right? The U.S. is the most prosperous country in the world, right? And I think there's probably, I could be wrong, but probably never been an impact investment made in the United States. What's been made? It's been people coming up with ideas of things that they think are interesting, that other people want to consume, starting businesses, getting validation, and having a funding ecosystem which is forgiving and which is entrepreneurial in order for them to be able to do those things. If we were taking the lens of impact investors, the smartphone would have never existed, right? The iPhone, when it started, it's kind of frivolous, right? Is like, you can already talk to people, you can already take pictures with cameras, let's just put it together, it's a little more fun, a little more exciting. But fundamentally, it's created an ecosystem that probably is creating kind of the fourth wave of advancement from a technological standpoint. So when we think about our impact, we think about three things. One is digital inclusion, which we fundamentally think is important. And the way that you get people online is not with, you know, telling them what inputs need to go into their farm. It's not with like telling them, you know, seeing where their generic drugs came from with a scanner code. Fundamentally, people come online en masse to talk to their friends and family and to do fun things, right? And from there, they understand, you know, how to use connected devices. They understand the internet, and they can expand from there to do more useful things. So digital inclusion is the first piece. The second is like gamified learning. In geographies where, regardless of what you learn in the school, most of what creates like a well-functioning adult are learned outside of school. They're learned at home, they're learned with your friends, they're learned on TV, they're learned watching PBS. There's a lot of fabric about what people do or don't know, what is saving, what's compounded interest, how do you write a job description, you know, what do you wear if you want to sort of impress someone as a professional as opposed to what you would wear, you know, generally. And like in a world where that doesn't exist in the fabric, I think you have to create gamified ways or entertaining ways for people to be able to pick up that knowledge. And that's one of the things we do. And finally, most importantly, as I said, jobs are impact. You create big, valuable companies, doesn't matter what they do. As long as they're not fundamentally destroying the earth or their consumers, they are having a positive impact. And so I would like to just leave you with a quote, which I think reiterates some of that, which I think, and it's from The Economist. It was talking about India, which now has the lowest data costs in the world because of some very aggressive competitive practices by a challenger. And what it says is, look, people want to stay in touch with each other. They want to be entertained. They want to express themselves, no matter their income or where they call home. The poorer the people are, the more a phone outperforms all other options of fulfilling these needs. When it comes to getting online, play dominates work and leisure overtakes labor. This is the thesis of our company. This is our small way of trying to contribute to the overall shared prosperity of the continent. And we hope we're successful. Thank you very much.
One, people who see challenges and focus on the opportunities. And then the second type are people who see you're obviously from the first group. You started with the challenge, right? But then you took us through what you're doing. Can we drill down a little deeper? How have you been able to navigate, or help your startups navigate these challenges to create what you created? What are some of the real tactical procedures that you use?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the interesting thing about startups is that fundamentally they're hard, right? The difference between, I would say, a new company and a startup is that a startup is trying to do something that they believe doesn't exist or exists in a limited form. They say you shouldn't do anything that isn't 10x better than the alternative. So the hill to climb is necessarily steep. And so I think there are a few fundamental things. And there's a really great book. It's kind of become my Bible as an entrepreneur, which is called A Hard Thing About Hard Things. And it's by a guy named Ben Horowitz. He was one of the first founders at Netscape and then LoudCloud. And he says, focus on the road and not the wall. So he said when you learn to drive a race car for the first time, and you're going 200 miles an hour around a curve, they tell you, focus on the road and not the wall. If you focus on the wall, you'll end up careening into the wall. And if you focus on the road, then you have a chance of navigating this ecosystem and sort of making it to the finish line alive. And I think that's really one thing. I think it's very, very important to be cognizant and realistic about the challenges. I consider myself a realist. Some people may consider me somewhere slightly south of that. But fundamentally, I believe in real talk, and I believe in understanding and internalizing challenges. But just focusing on that is self-defeating, and you'll never get out of bed in the morning or start anything. I think challenges beget opportunities, and fundamentally, challenges are opportunities because now you have something to surmount. And if you do, now you've created something that hasn't existed before, and that potentially could be big, valuable in the monetary and the social sense. So one is just honestly, the biggest challenge with startups is managing your own psyche, right? Because perhaps if you're like me, you go from a large organization with lots of sort of checks and lots of safety nets and things, and you thought you had stress before, but you've never seen stress. You've never seen even a fraction of it, right? It goes things go like this, hour to hour, day to day, minute to minute. It all resides on you, so if it goes wrong, there's no one else to look at. And fundamentally, you tend to raise money and extract resources from the people who you care about, respect the most, and oftentimes who are most well positioned in the world, right? So it's a cocktail that creates a lot of pressure. And so the first thing is learn to manage yourself, learn to manage your psyche, learn to sort of focus on the road and not the wall. And then the second one is go and find someone who is as committed as you. I believe in co-founders, always. Some of the only mistakes I've made is in believing that one person is just such a rock star that they're going to be able to figure it out. And the truth is, it's very, very, very unusual, particularly in challenging contexts. So those are two things. There are sort of a whole host of other things. But if you get those two right, then you have a chance. And if you don't get at least one of those right, then you're basically dead in the water.
Thank you. Manage your psyche and focus on the road. So I'd like to throw it out to the audience. Any questions for this one?
I know you mentioned following Tencent's playbook. I was just curious what differences you saw in their playbook since they had the rise of China. What differences are there between the rise of China and the rise of Africa, and how do you adjust for that?
Very good question. So there are a few big differences. One, China is a country and Africa is a continent. May seem like an obvious point, but it has very significant implications. The fragmentation on the continent makes a lot of things more challenging in that you don't have centralized governance, you don't even necessarily have, let's say, free trade or freedom of movement. And so I usually make it a pet peeve, but it's a little obnoxious to do in a speech of saying yeah, we're talking about countries and not a region or a continent. And so for us, what it means is that we have to, one, understand the different geographies, understand the cultural nuances. What works in one place won't necessarily work in the other. And you have to focus. I always say we're creating a pan-African platform, in air quotes, because what it really means is we're going to focus on 10 of the biggest, most impactful and important countries on the continent across a few different regions. So that's the first thing. Two, you don't have communist government, fundamentally, right? So Tencent benefited a lot from just straight up hardcore, anti-competitive regulation, right? Like WhatsApp doesn't exist in China. And so WeChat, has like a lot of room to sort of to grow and flourish without competition. And so, what we've had to focus on is how do you create barriers to entry that are more operational and more around your capabilities as opposed to structural. And for us, again, we focus on the challenges, right? The three big challenges that we laid out, if we create technology, internal capabilities to be able to systematically scale those, we've now created a moat around our business. And therefore, we have that window of time to scale and become big and powerful and awesome, which Tencent had, but for different reasons.
Just a follow-up on that, because I noticed that a lot of your market focuses on Nigeria. And I'm Nigerian, so I can say this. I usually tell people that there's a method behind the madness. You seem to find that method, but you say it so casually, like someone who's interested in entering that market might think it's a lot more easier than it is. So what are some of the unique challenges that you
They're extraordinary. Operating, Nigeria is a fascinating place because the scale is extraordinary. You have 190 million people. The sort of nature of the people is very, very interesting. Very dynamic, very hardworking, very, very smart, and entrepreneurial.
I didn't pay him to say that.
It's a place that really is growing and adapting in spite of its governance, right? Because the people have so much ingenuity and hustle. But fundamentally, it lacks infrastructure, period, right? Lagos has 20 million people. It is extraordinarily chaotic. And so operationally, so there's extraordinary opportunity. Anyone who goes there can see it. You go there, you take a trip, you have the twinkle in your eye, you're like, I know what they need. They need this, right? They need a bus ticketing platform. And then you go to start doing it, and you realize that the buses have some, they look informal, but they're organized, right? There's some organized structure that works its way up, whether it's an open market where there's just millions of people milling around, or it's some informal organization, et cetera, and there's an entrenched structure there. So one, showing up and saying, don't do it this way, do it that way. Most people would just look at you. Or they'll nod and take your money and then just look at you. So there's chaos, there's underlying structure that you can't understand until you spend time there and actually engage. And then again, it's just a very, very rugged operating environment. So look, the only way I believe to work through that is to have true local context. like, you have to go and spend time there. I lived in Lagos for 5 years. Like, I went through the challenges, the traffic jams, the fuel shortages, showing up to work, ready to go early at 8 a.m. and then realizing you're not going to have internet that day, right? And then, like, what are you going to do? Go back in traffic for an hour to go back home? So you have to understand both the challenges and like sort of the cultural nuances to it. And you can do it by showing up and spending a bunch of time there. It's impractical for most people. The other way to do it is to find trusted local partners who do understand it. And you bring something, they bring something, and you work together to try and create sustainable solutions.
Other questions?
So when thinking about, you spoke a lot, Cordel, about the fintech space and that movement there. We recently saw Facebook come up with the Libra and think about cryptocurrency. And for me, when I was just looking at their strategy and trying to hypothesize where they're going with this, I came down to the African continent and thinking about how we've got weak currencies already. They've got a lot of the market share with WhatsApp and Facebook itself, with Apple. And in that introduction of the Libra, could do so well there. How does that play into, as these companies invent like digital currency, how does that play into your model and what you're thinking about in the tech space?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I thought the same thing. I think fundamentally where they're going or where they want to go is to leverage chat as an interface for digital payments, which makes a lot of sense. Because chat is ubiquitous, and if you've seen in other places, coupling the two together can be quite dynamic. Look, I think having a third-party currency that is neither one nor the other and has interoperability across all currencies would be spectacular for the continent. The fragmentation is problematic. You may not know this, but like everything is dollarized basically in the world outside of Europe. And so it creates very odd market dynamics. I'm a sugar miller in Nigeria. I buy the raw sugarcane from Brazil. And then I sell it in Naira locally in Nigeria. In order to buy whatever my raw materials from Brazil, I need to get the Brazilian real, Nigerian naira. I need to go source dollars to do that. Because they will only accept dollars from me. There is no, interchange or market maker between real and naira. And so everything, no matter where you source it around the world, whether it's packaging, other raw materials, heavy equipment, I want to set up a factory, I'm buying some machinery from China or wherever, I need to source usually dollars, but sometimes euro. And so what you find is you have structurally weak currencies in Africa because currencies are denominated in X versus the dollar. And you get these massive shortages. In 2014 and 15, Nigeria was basically completely crippled because oil prices crashed. Oil is, 80 to 90% of all sort of foreign currency flows in the country. And now people who have nothing to do with oil and fundamentally have nothing to do with dollars can't run their businesses, right? The economy goes in the tank, recession for 2 years. So I've always thought about crypto as like an interesting way to disintermediate that or intermediate that, which is like, look, if there's something that the Brazilians and the Nigerians and the Kenyans and the Zimbabweans consider to be valuable and interoperable with their currency, now you don't need to go, Naira, dollar, Naira. You can go, Naira, some market maker that uses Libra, and then Real, right? And so, like, all of these, like, structural imbalances that you have, which create extraordinary issues. I mean, extraordinary. As an investor, they're like, your two biggest risks investing on the continent are FX and partner risk, right? By far, right? When I was in the US, neither of those really existed. So I think it's potentially powerful. I'm not a huge Facebook fan, so them creating another way to like dominate and subjugate the world is not that exciting for me. But the concept is very interesting. Hopefully, no Facebook people here.
Just to add on that, what do you think are going to be the benefits if Africa decides to have one common currency?
Well, look, I think a common currency, in the traditional sense, is highly unlikely. But some kind of like intermediary currency is possible. Look, I think there would be extraordinary benefits. I think one, just like the way governments operate, the insistence and the extraordinary amount of time in the financial system, the banks, governments, and people for sourcing currency, which takes up an extraordinary amount of like useful capacity, will disappear, and that can go to more productive ends. I think what they call South-South trade will expand dramatically. It's an interesting anecdote. When I was living in Lagos, there's like a kind of nice high-end grocery store called Deli's, and you can go there and you can get like nice meats and fresh produce and all this stuff. So I was buying dill, and you look at the packaging. The dill is from the Netherlands. Cool, that makes sense. They're really good at ag. And then you look at the back. The dill was sourced from Kenya. So this dill was grown in Kenya, flown more than likely to the Netherlands, processed, packaged, and then flown probably in like a passenger flight to Lagos, and there I am buying it to like sprinkle on my salad, right? Like that's completely asinine, right? Like that shouldn't exist, right? Like if I need dill in Kenya, in Nigeria, and Kenya is one of the biggest and most prolific producers of a number of agricultural goods, like there should be direct linkages. And the tariff systems should be structured so that it facilitates that. And FX, again, is another important component of that. So I think it changes everything, and you would see very demonstrable uplift as a result.
How did you personally find your trusted local partners, and what would you recommend the process to be for companies that may not be in the same industry as you?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been a bit lucky in that I went and sort of did my hardship tour in Nigeria for 5 years. So I both got to understand the landscape, and I traveled all over the continent. So we invested in Kenya, Tanzania, SA. I even looked at investments in Egypt. So it was a bit easier for me. I think if I didn't have that, there are a number of organizations which are emerging that are trying to sort of bridge the gap. So there's a U.S. Africa Business Council. There are a couple of them. There are some intermediaries that help sort of facilitate and bring people together. There is a never-ending sort of conference tour where people go and make sort of grandiose claims about what's happening and what will happen. I wouldn't go to any of the sessions, but show up there with a bunch of business cards and meet people, like-minded people, and get to know them. I think is very valuable. So I think there are both sort of forums, and I think there are emerging organizations that can give an organization in the States the opportunity to interface with people and start to build that trust and access.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. My name is W.E.D. Cruz, and hi, Cordel. I'm similarly in the fintech e-commerce space, and I just returned last week from the United Nations General Assembly in New York, where we sat at a fintech roundtable that included a lot of the presidents of the fintech applications that you named, such as Flutterwave, Triple Cash, Paga, and there was this discourse between can innovation be regulated? And what is the government's part or play in kind of the advancement of fintech and technology across the continent? So I'm just curious to know what your take is on that kind of dichotomy.
Yes, I have some views. Look, I believe that there are some things the government does well and there are some things that they do poorly. And the weaker your government structures, the more things they do poorly and the fewer things they do well. I think innovation is one thing that just fundamentally government does poorly, and in many ways for good reason, right? I think government exists to, I think needs to be conservative by nature. I think has an inclination and incentive to control as opposed to sort of allow. And so, my overarching view is that, and I'm sure it's obvious, in the US context, it has sort of political implications. Remove those for the moment. But I fundamentally believe that kind of like the less African governments get involved when it comes to like digital innovation, the better. That their role is to sort of create as much of an enabling environment as possible. So like get connectivity, make it available, sell spectrum to like reasonable parties that can sort of productize it and disseminate it widely. Make it easier for people to start businesses, make it less punitive for them to fail. A lot of the things that have made the US great and like a beacon of like innovation. So that's my view, that there are a couple, like if you look at M-Pesa, which is like, it's always the shining example of like innovation. It only existed because the Kenyan government had yet to get their act together and regulate the distinction between a financial services company and a non-financial services company. So M-Pesa was started by a telecom company, which had extraordinary distribution, phone and a SIM card, and they had agents all over the country. So you knew, no matter if I'm porting over cash, if I want to go and get my money out, there's a guy down the road, I can go and I can withdraw. That's critically important to create that ecosystem, and you've seen what the implications have been. There's only one M-Pesa. There's no like strong mobile money ecosystem in Nigeria, South Africa, Ghana a little bit, and fundamentally it's because government already sort of had drawn this distinction. A bank is a bank. If you want to make transfers, if you have stores of value, you have to get this whole suite of licenses, which is really hard, has capital requirements, and is just like painful deterrent. So like there, the absence of government and the absence of regulation enabled something very, very powerful and effective to be created and to flourish. And I think there would be many more examples if that were the case. I know a bunch of startups that are doing really interesting things, and their biggest risk is that the government wakes up one day and realizes that like they're flaunting one particular regulation or rule, and they shut them down. Right? So like that's my view.
Unfortunately, we have to stop. But Tim, Cordel, how long did you stay?
So I will be here all day. At some point, I'll need to pop out and check out in my hotel room. But otherwise, I'm here and happy to chat.
So yes, please grab your hallways at lunch. Again, can we have a round of